400 years ago, German miners refused to touch a certain rock because they believed a goblin lived inside it, cursing it. They were wrong about the goblin. What they didn't know is that the rock was real, valuable, and about to become one of the most fought-over substances on the planet. What you probably don't know is that you are almost certainly touching a refined version of that exact same rock right now. Somewhere inside your phone, packed into a battery smaller than a deck of cards, is a metal you have probably never thought about once in your life. You didn't choose it. You didn't ask for it. But there is a real documented chance that somebody dug it out of the ground by hand in Central Africa, using nothing but a shovel and their own fingers, and that somebody was a child. That metal is cobalt, and its story is one of the strangest, darkest supply chains in the modern world. To understand how strange this is, you first have to understand what normal looked like for most of human history. For thousands of years, people used a brilliant, saturated shade of blue in their glass, pottery, and jewelry, and not one of them had any idea what was actually producing that color. It shows up in Egyptian statuettes and Persian jewelry from the 3rd millennium BC, worn by people who had no concept of chemistry as we understand it today. It shows up in glass fragments buried at Pompeii, sealed under volcanic ash for nearly 2,000 years. A color that survived a volcanic eruption, completely unaltered. It shows up in Chinese pottery glazes from the Tang dynasty around 600 AD and later in the deep blue and white porcelain of the Ming dynasty, some of the most valuable ceramic art objects ever produced. Civilizations that never once communicated with each other, separated by oceans and centuries, independently prized the exact same color, produced by the exact same unidentified substance, without a single person on Earth knowing what it actually was. That ignorance was the normal state of affairs. What changed it is the story you are about to hear. This is the story of how that rock became the metal that quietly powers nearly every phone, laptop, and electric vehicle on the planet. It runs through a Belgian colonial empire, a 1961 political assassination, the raw material behind the first atomic bomb, and a court case decided just 2 years ago that let some of the most powerful companies on Earth walk away from allegations tied to the deaths of children. At the center of it is one man who spent years proving a superstition wrong, without ever imagining what his discovery would eventually cost, or who would end up paying that cost centuries after his own death. In the mountains of Saxony, in what is now Germany, miners in the 14 and 1500s were digging for silver and copper, the metals that actually made a mining town wealthy and kept families fed through the long winters. Every so often, they hit a strange, metallic-looking rock that resembled copper ore, closely enough to get their hopes up each time. It never was copper. Worse, when they tried to smelt it using ordinary techniques, it released a foul, toxic vapor that made miners violently ill, sometimes fatally so, an invisible poison with no obvious source. With no chemistry to explain what was happening underground, they reached for the explanation that made emotional sense to them. Mischievous spirits called kobolds, goblins living beneath the mountain, were sabotaging the ore, punishing miners by hiding real copper and replacing it with something poisonous and worthless instead. They named the rock after the goblin they blamed, Cobalt ore. It was easier to believe in a curse than to accept that centuries of mining knowledge simply had no answer for what they were looking at. For roughly 200 years, that reputation stuck. But here is the problem with declaring something worthless. Sometimes it isn't. The same cursed ore, once processed into a pigment glassmakers called smalt, produced one of the richest, most stable blue colors available anywhere in Europe, prized precisely because it held its color under sunlight and heat far better than many alternative dyes. Ceramicists wanted it, painters wanted it, Households even used a diluted version of it, sprinkled into laundry water under the name bluing, to counteract the yellowing of white linens, a technique that persisted in homes well into the 20th century. Nobody doing the laundry and nobody buying the porcelain had any idea they were using a refined version of the same rock miners were still cursing underground. It was intuitive chemistry, stumbled into by trial and error, completely disconnected from any real understanding of what the substance actually was. That disconnect held for 2 centuries, until one man refused to accept it. In 1735, a Swedish chemist named Georg Brandt, working at Sweden's Board of Mines, set out to settle an argument that had gone unresolved for decades. Most scientists assumed the blue color came from bismuth, an element frequently found tangled up with the same troublesome ore, and the scientific consensus of the time saw little reason to look further. Brandt had already built a reputation exposing fraudulent alchemists who claimed they could turn lead into gold, publicly demonstrating their tricks in front of skeptical audiences, and he brought that same relentless, patient skepticism to this new puzzle. Through careful, painstaking experimentation, separating the mysterious substance from the bismuth it kept hiding behind, Brandt proved that neither bismuth nor a goblin was responsible for anything. There was a real, previously unidentified element sitting inside that cursed rock the entire time, distinct from every other known metal. He named it Cobalt, borrowing directly from the very superstition that had haunted German minds for 2 centuries, a small, almost sly acknowledgement of the myth he had just permanently dismantled. In doing so, Brandt became the first person in recorded history, credited by name, with discovering a metal unknown to the ancient world. Gold, silver, iron, copper, tin, lead, and mercury had all been known since prehistory, discovered by nobody in particular. Over centuries, nobody can trace back to a single moment. Cobalt had a birth certificate. It had Brandt's name on it. Here is why that moment mattered far beyond chemistry history. Once cobalt had a name and a known chemical identity, it could be studied, refined, and deliberately searched for. Rather than stumbled upon by accident in a mountain, nobody wanted to mine. That single shift, from unidentified curse to identified element, set the domino chain in motion. Once scientists understood cobalt as a real substance, with real measurable properties, it was only a matter of time before someone discovered what those properties were actually good for beyond coloring glass. And it turned out cobalt was extraordinary. It could produce powerful, stable magnets that held their strength longer than earlier alternatives. It could survive extreme heat without losing structural integrity, making it essential for superalloys inside jet engines and gas turbines, machinery that did not even exist yet when Brandt first isolated the element. Eventually, in the 20th century, it would become a critical ingredient in rechargeable lithium-ion batteries. The exact technology now sitting in your pocket. Each new use multiplied global demand, and every time demand multiplied, the world went looking for more of the raw ore Brandt had first identified in a Swedish laboratory, chasing a resource that turned out not to be evenly distributed across the planet at all. Long before that industrial demand existed, Cobalt Blue quietly built an entire cultural economy around itself. European royal porcelain workshops competed to produce the deepest, most flawless cobalt glazes, staking their reputations on a color most of their customers assumed had always simply existed in nature. Painters reached for cobalt blue for centuries afterward, including Vincent van Gogh's, whose swirling night skies owe part of their intensity to the same pigment German miners once threw away in disgust. A rock cursed by superstition had become, without anyone connecting the dots, a fixture of high European art and luxury craftsmanship. But pigment could only take Cobalt's story so far, and there is a case worth pausing on that shows how differently this story could have unfolded. In 1844, a mining operation in Norway called Blafarververket, near the town of Modum, began systematically extracting cobalt at a scale nobody had previously attempted. At its peak, This single Norwegian operation supplied roughly 80% of the entire world's cobalt, using convict labor under harsh, but at least documented and regulated Norwegian mining law, with output records, inspection systems, and a legal structure that, whatever its flaws, at least left a paper trail. For a brief period in the 19th century, if you wanted cobalt, you were almost certainly buying it from a fjord in Norway, not from anywhere in Africa. It is a strange, mostly forgotten detour, and it matters because it proves cobalt's later, much darker chapter in Central Africa was never geologically inevitable. It was a choice made by whoever controlled the largest deposits once they were finally located. And a different choice could plausibly have been made. Those larger deposits were found in 1914, when a Belgian mining company called Union Minière du Haut-Katanga discovered massive reserves of cobalt-bearing copper ore in the Katanga region of the Belgian Congo, a discovery that would end up reshaping the global cobalt trade for the next 100 years. The scale dwarfed anything Norway had ever produced, and it did not take long for the company to realize exactly what it had found. By 1926, barely 12 years later, Colonial Congo had already become the largest cobalt-producing territory on Earth, a title the region, later renamed the Democratic Republic of Congo, has essentially never given up since. Union Minière did not achieve that dominance through fair wages or safe conditions. The company built its empire on forced colonial labor, conscripting Congolese workers into mining and refining operations, engineered to extract the absolute maximum output at the absolute minimum cost, with colonial administrators providing little meaningful oversight and even less accountability. Workers who resisted or fell short of production quotas faced punishment enforced by colonial officials who answered to shareholders in Brussels, not to anyone living anywhere near the mines themselves. If you are finding this interesting, hit subscribe. There is a lot more coming, and this is only the halfway point of where Cobalt's story actually goes. Katanga's underground wealth did not stop at cobalt and copper, and this is where the story takes a genuinely staggering left turn. In 1915, the very same mining region yielded an extraordinarily rich deposit of uranium ore at a site called Shinkolobwe, purer than anything found anywhere else on the planet, before or since. Decades later, that Congolese uranium was shipped to the United States and used directly in the Manhattan Project, supplying raw material for the first atomic bombs ever detonated. Think about that for a moment. One mining region in Central Africa, controlled by one Belgian company, ended up supplying both the metal that would power the modern battery economy and the fuel behind the single deadliest weapon ever built by human beings. Two entirely different chapters of 20th century history, running on minerals pulled out of the exact same hills. That kind of geopolitical importance rarely stays contained to a mining company's boardroom for long, and Katanga's story proves it better than almost anywhere else on Earth. When the Congo won independence from Belgium in 1960, its first democratically elected Prime Minister, Patrice Lumumba, lasted only months in office before Katanga province, backed openly by Belgian mining interests desperate to protect their access to cobalt, copper, and uranium, attempted to secede from the new country entirely. Lumumba was removed from power, arrested, and assassinated in January of 1961, an operation later documented to have involved both Belgian and American intelligence. Driven substantially by Cold War anxiety over who would end up controlling the country's mineral wealth, and whether that control might tilt toward the Soviet Union. The chaos that followed installed Mobutu Sese Seko, a dictator who ruled the renamed nation of Zaire for the next 32 years, presiding over one of the most corrupt governments in modern African history, while foreign mining companies kept extracting the same resources that had made the region worth destabilizing in the first place. Fast forward to the present. And Katanga's minerals are still shaping the world, just through a different mechanism. Today, a portion of the region's cobalt is extracted through what the mining industry euphemistically calls artisanal and small-scale mining, meaning informal digging done largely by hand, without industrial machinery, without structural reinforcement, and often without any safety equipment whatsoever. Miners, sometimes entire families working together, dig narrow shafts dozens of feet underground using little more than hand tools, descending into tunnels with no ventilation and no emergency escape routes, breathing dust and toxic fumes for hours at a time in near total darkness. Investigators and human rights organizations have documented children as young as 6 years old working inside these mines, hauling sacks of raw ore through the same unsupported passages that regularly collapse without warning. One particularly devastating collapse killed 35 miners in a single incident, many of them 17 years old or younger. These are not isolated accidents. They are the predictable, recurring outcome of an extraction system nobody with real power has strong enough incentive to fix. Because for many families in the region, the alternative to sending a child underground is not sending that child to school instead. It is watching that household go without food. This crisis did not stay hidden. In 2018, journalist and researcher Siddharth Kara published detailed field reporting estimating that roughly 35,000 children were working across Congo's cobalt mining sites, a figure that spread rapidly through international media and became one of the most cited statistics in the entire debate over ethical sourcing. Investigations from the Washington Post, The Guardian, and Amnesty International had already been documenting the connection between cobalt mining and child labor since as early as 2016, years before any of it reached a courtroom. Mining companies and the technology giants that ultimately purchased their cobalt consistently pushed back against these reports, insisting their supply chains were closely monitored and their sourcing was clean. Even as the underlying journalism kept accumulating and the specific, named cases kept multiplying. Eventually, the exposure reached a legal breaking point. In December of 2019, the human rights organization International Rights Advocates filed a federal lawsuit against 5 of the largest technology companies on Earth: Apple, Alphabet, the parent company of Google, Dell, Microsoft, and Tesla. The suit was filed on behalf of 14 Congolese families whose children had been killed or seriously injured while mining cobalt, describing in graphic detail collapses that left some children paralyzed and others dead, families who had spent years searching for any avenue of accountability before turning to a foreign court system as a last resort. This looked, for a moment, like the crisis was finally going to force real institutional change, the same way earlier exposed scandals in other industries eventually forced regulation. It did not quite work out that way. None of the 5 companies denied that child labor exists somewhere within their cobalt supply chains. Instead, their defense rested on a narrower, more technical claim. Simply purchasing cobalt from suppliers further down the chain, they argued, did not make them legally responsible for what happened at the mines themselves. Microsoft's own attorneys summarized their position about as bluntly as possible. They buy cobalt. That, apparently, was meant to be the end of the discussion. Around the same time, governments made a separate attempt at institutionalizing a fix. The United States passed the Dodd-Frank Act back in 2010, which required companies to publicly disclose whether so-called conflict minerals, including cobalt-adjacent metals, appeared anywhere in their supply chains. Tech and automotive companies responded by publishing detailed supplier codes of conduct, formally prohibiting child labor anywhere in their production networks, and pointing to internal audits and industry-wide certification schemes as proof of compliance. On paper, the system looked like real progress, a genuine institutional response to a documented crisis. And it is worth noticing how familiar the pattern of that era's objections and reassurances sounds today. Publicly commit to a strict ethical standard, quietly keep purchasing from whoever can meet your price, and let the layers of middlemen between the mine and the factory absorb the actual responsibility whenever anyone comes asking questions. The debunking of that clean-sounding narrative came from the courtroom itself. In 2024, a federal appeals court finally ruled on the 2019 lawsuit, siding with the 5 technology companies and dismissing the case entirely, ruling that the act of purchasing a commodity on its own does not amount to illegal participation in whatever abuses were used to produce it. It was a legal outcome, not a factual one. The court did not dispute that children had been killed and injured mining the cobalt these companies purchased. It simply concluded that current law did not hold the companies accountable for it, regardless of how many audits or public commitments they had published in the years leading up to that ruling. Every certification scheme, every code of conduct, every statement about ethical sourcing turned out to carry no real legal weight the moment it was actually tested in front of a judge. In the years since, a handful of companies have tried to route around the problem rather than solve it directly. Several automakers and technology firms have invested heavily in cobalt-free or cobalt-reduced battery chemistries, most notably lithium-ion phosphate batteries, specifically to reduce dependence on Congolese supply chains rather than clean them up. Analysts now project that shift could meaningfully slow global cobalt demand growth within the next decade as manufacturers quietly engineer their way around a human rights problem instead of confronting it directly. Battery recycling programs have also expanded, aiming to recover cobalt from existing devices rather than mining fresh material, though recycling still represents only a small fraction of total supply. None of it has displaced the Democratic Republic of Congo from the center of the global cobalt economy, and analysts widely expect that dominance to persist for at least another decade. As of 2025, that position is almost impossible to overstate. The DRC produces somewhere between roughly 70 and 84% of the entire world's cobalt supply, depending on the year and the specific data source, dwarfing every other producing nation combined several times over. The next largest producer, Indonesia, accounts for under 15% of global output, and every remaining cobalt-producing country on the planet splits what little remains between them. Cobalt prices themselves have swung wildly in recent years, from highs of over $80,000 per metric ton in 2022 down to roughly $21,000 by early 2025. Volatility that makes it even harder for buyers anywhere in the chain to justify paying a premium for verified, ethically audited material when cheaper, unverified supply remains readily available. That volatility cuts both ways. A sudden price crash can mean the difference between an artisanal mining family earning enough to eat that week and earning nothing at all, which only deepens the pressure to keep digging regardless of the risk involved. Here is a detail that complicates any simple story about cobalt being inherently, unavoidably tied to exploitation. Australia and Canada also produce cobalt almost entirely as a byproduct of nickel and copper mining under far more heavily regulated labor and safety standards with unionized workforces and government safety inspections. And none of the tunnel collapses that have made international headlines out of the Congo. Their combined global market share sat at only around 2.5% in 2024, but is projected to grow to over 8% by 2035, driven partly by government investments specifically targeting supply chains free of the abuses documented in the Congo. Canada alone has committed more than $46 billion toward building a domestic electric vehicle battery supply chain, including funding aimed directly at cobalt sourced without the human costs attached to Congolese artisanal mining. It is proof that the abusive conditions surrounding so much of the world's cobalt were never a geological inevitability. Norway showed that in the 1800s. Australia and Canada are showing it again now, at far greater scale, with far more capital behind it. The difference has never really been about the rock itself. It has always been about who controls it, and what standard of accountability that controller is willing to be held to. There is one more detour worth taking before this story closes, because it shows Cobalt's story isn't purely a villain's tale. A radioactive isotope of the very same element, Cobalt-60, became one of the most important tools in 20th century medicine. Starting in the 1950s, Cobalt-60 radiotherapy machines, sometimes nicknamed Cobalt bombs by the doctors and patients who used them, delivered targeted radiation treatment to cancer patients around the world, decades before more sophisticated linear accelerators became widely available in wealthier countries. In parts of the developing world, Cobalt-60 units remained the primary tool for cancer treatment far longer than in the West, simply because they were cheaper to build, operate, and maintain. The same element that struggles to escape association with mining atrocities in Central Africa quietly saved an enormous number of lives in oncology wards on nearly every continent. A genuinely strange split identity for one metal to carry. So here is where all of it lands. An unnamed German miner, centuries ago, blamed a poisonous, useless rock on an underground goblin and gave it a name that stuck for 200 years. Georg Brandt spent years proving that superstition wrong, isolating a real, previously unidentified element and naming it Cobalt anyway, almost as a wink back at the myth he had just disproven. Norwegian convicts mined it by the ton at Modum in the 1800s under Norwegian law, at a scale that once supplied most of the world. A Belgian company found an even richer deposit in Katanga in 1914, built a colonial empire on forced labor, and stumbled into a second, far deadlier mineral buried in the same hills a year later, one that would eventually help end a world war and open the nuclear age. Congo's first elected leader was assassinated within months of independence, in part over control of that same mineral wealth, ushering in 3 decades of dictatorship. A radioactive cousin of the very same element went on to quietly save lives in cancer wards around the world, even as the element's own reputation stayed tangled up in exploitation. Decades later, children as young as 6 were documented digging cobalt by hand out of collapsing tunnels, feeding a battery economy worth tens of billions of dollars a year. Journalists exposed it. Families sued over it. A court let 5 of the biggest companies in the world walk away from it in 2024. And right now, in your hand or within arm's reach, sits a small piece of the very same story. Still unresolved, still running through the same hills Georg Brandt never lived to see. Still waiting for someone, somewhere, to actually be held responsible for it. If this taught you something you didn't know, hit subscribe and tell us which part of this story surprised you the most, because there's a lot more where this came from.